Welcome again, everybody, and thank you for joining us tonight. I'm Jane Field. I'm the Executive Director of the Maine Council of Churches, and we are an ecumenical coalition of 7 Protestant member denominations whose roots are in the Hebrew and Christian scriptures. That includes Episcopal, Lutheran, Presbyterian, Quaker, Unitarian Universalist, United Church of Christ, and United Methodist. And these members of ours, along with our 2 associate member churches, which are Hope Gateway in Portland and Union Church in Biddeford Pool, represent 437 local congregations all across Maine who have more than 55,000 members in their care. The Council's mission is to inspire people within, through, and beyond the church to unite in building a culture of justice, compassion, and peace, where the full humanity and dignity of every person and the sacredness of all creation are affirmed and protected. One of the ways we fulfill that mission is by offering this program, this biennial faith-based advocacy series that's designed to equip and empower people to speak with a voice of faith for justice to those entrusted with governing and the creation of good public policy. Tonight's session is the 3rd and final legislative workshop of this year's series. But before I introduce to you our workshop presenters tonight, I'd like to begin, as we always do, by inviting you to breathe deeply and ground and center yourself while I offer a land acknowledgement. We do this as one small step toward correcting stories and practices that have erased Indigenous peoples' history and culture. And we do it because we hope it will inspire all of us to take responsibility, to take action, and to become repairers of the breach. So I acknowledge that the land that the Maine Council of Churches offices are on and the land on which I make my home are part of the territory of the Abenaki and Okosisco tribes, who lived in right relation with this land for more than 12,000 years before European colonizers arrived. And their Wabanaki descendants live here still. Will you be in a spirit of prayer with me? Creator God, as we gather here tonight and in all of our gatherings, help us to listen compassionately, to speak humbly, and to act justly. Grant us vision to see the brokenness of the past. Grant us ears to hear one another's needs for healing in the present. And grant us courage, patience, wisdom, and hope to work together for the future you dream. Amen. And now it is my pleasure to introduce the first of tonight's speakers. They're joining us from Preble Street and from the Homeless Voices for Justice. The Preble Street Faith Advocacy Network, or FAN, is actually one of the official partner organizations of the Maine Council of Churches. First, I'll introduce to you Terence Miller, JD, who joined Preble Street as Advocacy Director in June 2021. Formerly, he was a practicing criminal defense attorney for the Legal Aid Society in Brooklyn, New York, and a human rights attorney documenting the disappeared and the executed under the military dictatorship in Chile. For many years, Terence directed Mary Knowles' Justice and Peace Office in Washington, D.C., and he participated in several faith policy coalitions, including the Washington Office on Africa and Churches for a Middle East Peace. For 24 years, he was a senior international education officer and worked at public and private universities, including Marquette University in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. His colleague is Devon Stockmayer. She's the Advocacy Supervisor at Preble, having just joined the organization this past September. Devon comes from a creative writing background at Hamilton College, and she holds a master's in narrative medicine from Columbia University. She has previous experience in mental health and domestic violence advocacy and casework. Now, you may be wondering what narrative medicine is. I know the first time I met Devon, I asked. Narrative medicine is a more holistic approach to healthcare and care-based relationships. And it centers on looking at illness and people's experiences through a narrative lens. This training is the framework for Devon's advocacy work. It prompts her to continually explore how stories can become policy. Next, I'll introduce to you Lisa Franklin. She's an advocate with Homeless Voices for Justice and a person in long-term recovery from opioid addiction who has lived experience with homelessness. She joined HVJ because she feels compelled to help those that may be battling either or both of these impactful life challenges. She's guided by the belief that it's her duty to help inform our greater community about the continued life and death struggles of those facing homelessness and addiction. Finally, their colleague Rick Lemire is joining us tonight. He's also a member of Homeless Voices for Justice, and he too has lived experience of homelessness. He participates in peer support roles throughout the community. And we are so honored and delighted to welcome all four of you here with us this evening. I think you're going to start us off with an overview of some of the issues facing Mainers who are experiencing homelessness or struggling due to the lack of affordable housing here. And then you'll give us a look at some of the legislation to address these issues that will likely come before our state legislature this session. Welcome and thank you.
Great, thank you, Jane. We're going to start the evening. Devon, would you like to start us off?
Yeah, ever a fan of narrative, I'm actually going to ground us with a poem by James Baldwin that is untitled. Lord, when you send the rain, think about it, please, a little. Do not get carried away by the sound of falling water, the marvelous light on the falling water. I am beneath that water. It brings me to the light.
Thanks, Devon. And thank each and every one of you for joining us this evening. We'd like to be called the feisty friends of the Maine Council of Churches. We own that title. It's fabulous to be in partnership with Faith Action Network, as well as the Maine Hunger Initiative, Homeless Voices for Justice, for a long time has been a friend and contributor to the policy arena for the Maine Council of Churches. As many of you know, Preble Street is a unique combination of direct service and advocacy. Direct service to the homeless, those that have been trafficked, to the hungry in our city, to the various people and most vulnerable in our society. But part of the mission, and this is really critical, is to identify and implement solutions. So let me just start. I think a lot of times, and we hear this all the time, of the importance of identifying for long-term solutions, affordable housing for low-income individuals. And Preble Street, like all housing providers, is committed to that long-term solution. But as Greg Payne told us yesterday, Greg Payne is the housing advisor for Governor Mills, and he spoke with Maine Council of Churches Policy Committee yesterday, and he indicated that we lack 25,000 units in the state of Maine without affordable housing. And so while that is a long-term solution, and we are advocating for that, we also know that we're in crisis. We're in an emergency situation, and very similar to when you pull up to a hospital and someone is bleeding out, or having a heart attack, is in that emergency. You don't go to the regular ward, you go to an emergency room. And that's what shelters are for people who are impacted by homelessness. And that is a core component, that emergency shelter assistance that Preble Street and other providers are providing to people that are experiencing homelessness. And so it's important to start the conversation, because many legislators will say, why are we resources at the front end of this issue when we need long-term solutions? And so the emergency room comparison is a quick and easy, because we all realize in healthcare you need that, and that's what you need when there's an emergency shelter need. And so with that being said, I'm going to turn it over to Devon to talk about some of the.
Okay, I just want to pause. Jane, should we turn our camera off, do you think?
Well, of course, as soon as I sent you the message to do that, it got a lot better. You're not freezing right now. So
Okay.
let's see if we can all cross our fingers and toes and it'll keep on working.
Okay,
Sorry.
we'll cross our fingers and toes. Devon?
Yeah. So when we think of shelter as that key component to beginning to think about solutions to homelessness, I think we all have a particular vision of what a homeless shelter might look like or does look like in our heads. And often those are crowded, congregate spaces where people don't get a lot of space, personal space, maybe like a lukewarm meal, 4 nights sleep, a lot of overcrowding and discomfort. Preble Street has focused in recent years on reimagining the concept of the shelter to really serve the whole person and honor the dignity of the individuals who stay there and up the standard of quality and care that they're receiving. So this October, we opened our newest project. It is a 24/7, what's called a wellness shelter named Elena's Way. That's right near all of the main Preble Street buildings. We have a bill in right now sponsored by Representative Mike Brennan. It's currently in LR form that will sponsor Elena's Way. The wellness shelter concept is basically a 24-hour service-inclusive transitional housing space that is serving the most vulnerable of the population who are sleeping outside. A lot of these folks staying in Elena's Way have co-occurring mental health and substance use disorders. And the idea behind wellness shelters is to serve all of those needs at once in a meaningful way and to give these people a space to heal, to ultimately be able to hopefully transition into their own stable housing situation. I want to share some important statistics about Elena's Way shelter that really highlight the degree of need of the folks staying there, and that is that 100% of those living currently in Elena's Way were unsheltered prior to admission. 100% of them, even more importantly, were restricted from all other shelter options in the city, either with informal restrictions or CTOs, which are a legal restriction from spaces. So they literally have nowhere else to go. And then 79% of them were experiencing a co-occurring substance use disorder and 97% with a mental health diagnosis. We hope that Elena's Way can be a model for other future shelters that are not focusing on that congregate model and instead have this focused aim towards like small spaces and trauma-informed care. And this is just the beginning. And then Terence is going to talk a little bit about LD2, which is an omnibus housing bill.
So 11 months ago, Preble Street, along with there are 39 shelter providers in the state of Maine. We began a conversation with the Maine State Homeless Policy Committee. If we were really going to suggest things that would move the needle in the 131st legislative session, what would be those items? So we came up after extensive conversation and dialogue with a list that included funding emergency shelters as stated, because they're the emergency rooms for housing here in the state of Maine. We did realize that, as many of you know, there were some hotel accommodations for people during COVID for quarantine purposes and other purposes to remove them from congregate shelters. And we have seen, especially with long-term stayers, people who have extended or chronic homelessness, that 40 to 50 hotel rooms or private spaces of that nature would really be significant. This is a group that's monitored very closely on a weekly basis within the agencies and providers. We also want to provide simplification for general assistance, for diversion practices, for housing, and prevent people from becoming homelessness through the general assistance model. And we also want to create flexible housing stability workers. These would be housing navigators that would be inserted within the process. When the Speaker of the House, Rachel Talbot Ross, heard this litany, she indicated that she would want to put forward an omnibus bill that includes all of these into LD2. If you followed LD1 and you followed LD3 very closely, 2 comes right in the middle, because the Speaker recognized that addressing homelessness in this capacity, with the input from the experts that were actually working tandem with people of lived experience, that was a way to address this issue. And so LD2 is presently, as Devon articulated, a concept paper, but everything is there for the Speaker to finalize that and move on. I'd also be remiss not to mention Maine Equal Justice has a bill called the Home Act. It is being sponsored by Cheryl Gulek. And that's an act to enact the housing opportunity for Maine. It includes rental assistance, improving general assistance as well, and providing consumer protections to tenants. As many of you know, the housing issue is been identified by both the Democratic caucus in the House of Representatives and the Senate as the #1 policy issue. And within that, Senator Jackson and Speaker Talbot Ross put a joint housing committee together. And we have been told that everything will initially go to the joint housing committee. So LD2, the home bill, all the other bills that we articulate today. And then they will be farmed out to different committees. And so the Joint Housing Committee, Mark Swann, the Executive Director of Preble Street, in the orientation last Friday, oriented those representatives and senators to the array of issues that we're discussing this evening. But as we're discussing these housing issues, they are going to be mapped. When there's correlation, the Speaker has indicated an overlap, but there will be consolidation. So hopefully Maine Council of Churches through the Policy Committee will keep you abreast of those, so that if LD2 turns into something else, you are updated with the latest information in that regard. And then I want to talk about site-based housing first. This is a concept that many people have documented by Housing and Urban Development at the federal level. Academics have done extensive research on this model. And site-based housing first is illustrated here at Preble Street, if you're familiar with Logan Place, Houston Commons, Florence House, those entities. And so to start this conversation about this legislation, we thought we would call in one of the participants in our Housing First who has really benefited from this type of housing. Okay, while we're getting that, I can describe a little bit about site-based housing first, and then we'll hear from Boomer about his. Oh, is it good now?
Oh. Okay. You can just share more because I'm not here.
Okay. So site-based housing first is housing that is an approach to quickly and successfully connect individuals and families without preconditioners and barriers to entry, such as sobriety, treatment, or service participant requirements. supportive services are offered to maximize housing stability and prevent returns to homelessness, as opposed to addressing predetermined treatment goals before permanent housing entry. And so, are you ready? So please hear from a participant, a tenant in a housing first, as how this has impacted his life.
I'm Steve Littlefield. I'm gonna be 67 next month. I was homeless for over 45 years. I'm also on insulin that I haven't had in almost the past week because I don't need it. So don't you see, living here is, you know what I mean? It squares me, and it does, you know. But being here has been good. And I think there should be more places like this.
Great. Well, we agree with Boomer, and LR 1836, an act to end chronic homelessness by creating the Housing First Fund, is sponsored by Drew Gatine, and it is going to actually establish 400 new units in 12 to 15 new site-based Housing First locations throughout the state of Maine, so that these would be available in Bangor and Lewiston and other areas because of the importance as demonstrated in that by Boomer's testimony. And then decriminalization.
So criminalization of homelessness is a really important piece that may not feel so explicitly related to the housing issue, but it's a huge piece of the daily challenge of those experiencing homelessness. And it is often first experienced by people at the municipal level. It's not often thought of as a state issue. Recently, I believe in the last year, the Portland and South Portland police departments commissioned USM's Cutler Institute and the Rue Institute at Northeastern to conduct a study on police bias in the departments between 2018 and 2020, which was called Assessing Arrest and Traffic Stop Patterns. And that was mainly a study to examine racial bias, which did reveal disproportionate encounters between people of color in the Portland area as compared to their white counterparts. But it also contains some really interesting data on encounters of homeless individuals with law enforcement in this area. The West Bay Side neighborhood, which is where Preble Street and Oxford Street Shelter are located, is the most heavily policed area in Portland that has the most law enforcement encounters, which was confirmed in this report. And the report revealed that people experiencing homelessness are far more likely to experience law enforcement encounters and furthermore arrests, and also to experience multiple arrests, which essentially reveals that the system, the law enforcement system, and the carceral system is designed for recidivism. Amongst people who did experience arrests, the most common charges for those experiencing homelessness were warrants, violations of conditional release, criminal trespassing, public drinking, drug possession, and theft. And you can see that a lot of these are either ways in which the carceral system is keeping people looped up in it, so violations of conditional release and warrants, or common activities that people would not be criminalized for if they had a home, that being like drinking, public urination, and sleeping outside. So what's the role and responsibility of the state in the issue of criminalization? Where can that come in? Preble Street for the last couple sessions has been working on a larger scale on the issue of decriminalization. Last session, I was not at Preble Street, but we worked very closely with former now Representative Victoria Morales, who proposed a very large scope decriminalization bill that was looking to remove the legal penalties for people who are arrested for those aforementioned kind of daily activities, sleeping outside, drinking, and I can't remember the other one, but very basic ones. Unfortunately, as so often happens in the legislature with bills that have that grand scope, it was ultimately passed to be enacted in a significantly reduced form. It triggers a homelessness crisis protocol, is what they call it, which is to be, was determined by the Maine Attorney General. And it's essentially that law enforcement, when they encounter homeless individuals in a situation, are supposed to offer a list of resources. This session, we were approached by Speaker Rachel Talbot Ross, with whom Preble Street and HVJ has quite a close relationship, and specifically Homeless Voices for Justice, which is Preble Street's grassroots advocacy group for individuals experiencing homelessness, is who Rachel sought out when she was thinking about putting in a decriminalization bill. And throughout December, we worked closely with her on formulating the scope of this bill. It is still in LR format, as we've been talking about. This has been a really slow moving session, so a lot of what's going to be in the bills is not public yet. But to our knowledge, what we've settled on is kind of adding a remediation clause that is to be enacted when there are law enforcement encounters with homeless individuals. So instead of making an arrest and sending someone to jail for, say, sleeping outside or an instance of public drinking or public urination, they would be offered a list of resources and immediately connected to those services. That direct connection between that moment of arrest and the services as an alternative to being funneled into the carceral system. We don't know, again, fully what that bill is going to look like yet, but we're hoping that we can maintain something similar to the original scope of Victoria Morales's bill from last session. And now I have Rick Lemire, who was introduced earlier, who's a member of HVJ, who's going to speak to you about his experience with homelessness and with encounters with law enforcement in the greater Portland area.
Hello, everybody. My name is Rick Lemire, and this is the story of how I became a perceived criminal in the city of Portland. As of this August, or this previous August 2022, I became unsheltered in the Portland area, and after a few violent encounters just outside the Oxford Street shelter, I decided to start camping within the city limits of Portland. After having 3 or 4 campsites served by law enforcement, I began camping on a hiking trail as was recommended to me by a law enforcement officer in Portland. For about a month, I enjoyed my campsite before I received a no trespassing order from the park rangers. Emergency was experiencing. The park rangers were dispatched the same day to my campsite, likely based on the location that I had given to the 911 operator. I was still in the hospital the first day the park rangers came to deliver the no trespass order, so I received it the next day. The park rangers were much more pleasant to deal with than any of the law enforcement officers in Portland, so I do give them some credit there. But that resource card that Devon was speaking about, that they're supposed to give you, about 2/3 of the information was either not accurate or not relevant to the brand of homelessness that I was experiencing. Like the teen shelter number probably wasn't very targeted towards me. Perhaps the most aggravating and discriminatory event regarding my presumed homelessness happened the day after Christmas in Westbrook. While making a purchase at Cumbies on Main Street, a woman approached me asking if I was homeless or a hiker, because I had a large hiking backpack on at the time. After confirming her suspicions of my homelessness, she said, "Well, you just have fun with that." And about 10 minutes later, Detective Stackpole with the Westbrook Police Department was conducting a pedestrian stop on me. He claimed that the week before, he had witnessed me make a confession to him where I had confessed that I was in violation of my probation. I've never been arrested in my life and or charged with any crime or investigated for any crime to the best of my knowledge. So even after dispatch had come back that my background was all clear, I still was not allowed to leave the pedestrian stop because this detective was so sure that he knew me from somewhere, and his exact wording was that if you're not on probation, why do I know you? And I was not actually free to go from that pedestrian stop until I identified myself as one of the advocates for Homeless Voices for Justice. I decided to conduct my own investigation into this detective and actually also found out that the department had been sued in the past because of the detective inappropriately using the privileges and authorities of his badge to settle personal matters for his romantic partner. I think presumably this person was the person who was very uncomfortable being so close to the homeless person in Cumbies that day. Before becoming homeless in Portland, my interactions with law enforcement probably included somewhere around 3 traffic stops over the course of my 15 years of driving, with not a single ticket or citation. Since being homeless in Portland, however, I have been forced to interact with law enforcement between 10 and 12 times. Not because I had caused harm to another person or shoplifted from the corner store, but rather because I had taken my survival into my own hands by putting up a tent in some place free of violence. The most aggravating part of this crime to me, I have been committing, is that even after my request to officers during our unpleasant encounters, each and every one refused to give me a summons to court so I might be able to make my case in a court of law. In July of last year, the city of Portland adopted a policy to allow camping when the local shelters were filled to capacity. On the surface, this policy appears to mimic the Ninth Circuit Court case of Martin versus Boise, which fell back on the Eighth Amendment. Back on the Eighth Amendment to rule that the city of Boise could not prosecute people criminally for sleeping outside or on public property when those people had no home or other shelter to go to. Unfortunately, Maine does not fall under the Ninth Circuit jurisdiction. After thoroughly reading Portland's policy in its entirety, it became plain that the city left in place a number of loopholes for any number of scenarios so that they could have a multitude of reasons to disrupt virtually any campsite. Even if you manage to follow each and every aspect of the policy without falling victim to these loopholes, the city attorney made it clear to me that following the city policy does not excuse the fact that I was still breaking the law. Thank you guys for listening to my story of how I became a criminal in Portland.
Thanks, Rick. And Devon, there's a question in the chat for you and Rick about criminalization.
House.
Yeah,
Can someone read it out?
Is it homeless? So homelessness per se is not a crime. The 8 offenses of living outside are a crime. Loitering, sleeping, urination. And so while homelessness in and of itself is not a crime, the arrests come when homeless are encountered with those daily.
They are crimes that are activities inherent to humans existing outside. Like if you have nowhere else to use the bathroom, if all the public restrooms are closed, where are you going to go? If you have nowhere to sleep, you must sleep outside, and people are criminalized for these really simple things that housed folks would never have to worry about a day in their life.
And actually pitching the tent itself, or even a tarp to like make some sort of a shelter, is also criminalized in that town ordinance.
Great.
Thank you, Rick. So one of our last pieces is talking about something called the House program, which is a really important collaboration between Greater Portland Health and Preble Street's Health Services. It's meant to address the really high rate of opioid misuse and addiction that is a national and very much a local public health crisis. So the program aims to assist people who are experiencing both homelessness and substance use disorder simultaneously in accessing treatment for their substance use, case management, and then ultimately housing. And it offers long-term support so that those folks can continue their treatment and also find stability in their housing and living situation. We have put in a bill because that was a pilot program, a 2-year pilot that was extremely successful. And we have a bill that is, I believe, sponsored by Drew Gatine. It's still in LR status to make that program permanent because it has shown such wonderful success. And with a few modifications, which are going to include funding for peer support, specifically a housing specialist, because that is the perennial challenge in any program, is actually securing housing for folks. And also supporting a more flexible continuum of recovery for those who are accessing medication-assisted treatment. Lisa, an advocate with HVJ, is here to talk to you about her personal experience in the House program.
Yeah, hi you guys. My name is Lisa Franklin, and I just wanted to share with you guys why I feel this program, the reasons why I feel like it's so very important to continue. Just real briefly, I became homeless in the December of 2019 due to a domestic violence situation that I was experiencing. So that led me to begin experiencing homelessness here in Portland. Along with that, but many years before that, I'm sorry, let me start over with that part. I had a opiate addiction that began in 1992 that lasted until 2007. And I had a really successful stay at Crossroads for Women here in Wyndham, and began Suboxone treatment and going to recovery meetings and that whole journey, which was successful to me. So I say that to mean that it wasn't necessarily because of my addiction. My addiction was not why I became homeless, which often I think people assume that a lot, or that people that are homeless are addicts and what have you. So for myself, I just say that I had that under control. However, what I didn't have was anyway, I didn't have my doctor anymore. So I needed to begin to find this medication that I needed on a daily basis. So immediately the next day, I went to a facility right here in Bayside called Greater Portland Health that is affiliated with the Learning Collaborative, which is also part of Preble Street. And through the program, the House program, I was given an intensive worker to help me from the moment, I started day one of being homeless. I had that support person to help me navigate a very scary and just, gosh, I can't even think of the right adjectives to explain exactly how I was feeling. I don't know if maybe without that support, perhaps I might have gone back into my addiction. And there's lots of, factors in there that, I wonder about. But what I don't wonder about is how much I really owe that help with my success. I really do not feel I'd be sitting here right now speaking to you guys without that extra help. There's really no way to measure, the amount of help that they provided to me and other people in this program. I have maintained my sobriety. I have wonderful relationships with my children. I also have had lifelong mental illness struggles, and I was able to keep that kind of, on a kind of an even keel throughout the whole situation. Part of my domestic situation that I was with, I had some tooth loss, and I was able to go through a really, lengthy, confusing process of getting dentures. Gosh, so many things. But mainly, I think when people, number one thing where people, food and shelter are the number one things that people need in order to, live in this world. That's fine. But once you're in housing, and especially if you are somebody that struggles with addiction, it's just, you're in an isolating situation after you kind of like, you got a little nest again, you're back there, but that's not the end of the story. And, I don't want to compete with, the funding for housing is, utmost importance, but just, I can't really speak to how much the support is needed, not just for people, that are suffering or that are in recovery, but for everyone, but especially those people are just a lot more vulnerable to, not being able to maintain that housing, and it just becomes like a vicious cycle. So providing this money to continue this, extra help for this population within a population, I really think overall, and it will save money, if not, more. Sorry, I get so nervous. I really, really feel strongly about this, and it's just a really important thing, and I hope that it will be able to stick around.
Great. Thank you, Lisa. So as we wrap up with the legislation, I'd be remiss, Lisa said it so well, hunger and shelter go hand in hand. Preble Street has one final anti-hunger food security hub bill that's in an LR sponsored also by the speaker at this time, but that we will update you about accordingly when it gets into an LD state. I just want to, Jane just put in the chat, thank both Rick and Lisa for their testimony and their sharing. As you can see, these issues are from the heart, and I really do believe there's a lot of information out there, but as Christians, as people who call ourselves Christian or in that tradition of being committed to others, that empathy and compassion that you can show on this issue for people experiencing homelessness is a key dimension when you talk to your representative or write testimony, and put it within the context of the Sermon on the Mount, the Good Samaritan, which helps people universally to understand the need to be compassionate to the other. So on behalf of Preble Street and Homeless Voices for Justice, I'd like to thank Jane, Maine Council of Churches, for this opportunity to share with you tonight some of the priorities we are addressing in this legislative session. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And because we're in digital space, it's our custom to use the ASL sign for applause to let us know how much we appreciate everything you all are doing. And HVJ is an extraordinary resource for congregations in the state. You can talk to folks at Preble Street about engaging with them to come and speak. And it's well worth it, because when you hear people's stories, the way we've heard from Lisa and Rick tonight, it's profoundly impactful. And now when you go to talk to your legislators, you in the audience, you can say, I've met people, I've heard the stories of 2 people at least. And so I know that the House bill is important to make permanent, or I know how important it is to decriminalize living outside. So now we're going to turn to, and Terence, man, he set up the football, Peter, and now you're going to kick it through the goalposts, because what we're going to do is pivot a moment now and spend some time imagining ways that we can speak with our families, our congregations, our communities, and most especially with legislators at the state level, using a voice of faith for justice to explain how our deepest held beliefs and values are among the reasons why we support the bills under consideration that would address the housing crisis here in Maine. And our speaker, Shirley Hager, in the first legislative workshop, gave us the catchphrase for this year. A legislator asked her, why do you care so much? And we're here to help you guys begin to craft a frame and get some language in mind for how you could answer that question on this issue. Why do you care so much? And we're welcoming the Reverend Peter Swarr, and he's now popped into the spotlight here to help us with that conversation. Peter is the rector, which he says is the Episcopal speak for pastor or priest of Trinity Church in Portland, which is right on Forest Ave by Great Lost Bear, although I don't think that's in their church description when you go to look at how to find a church. It doesn't say go to Great Lost Bear and then hang a right. He was born in Biddeford, so he's a Mainer. He's proud to call Maine his home once again after having served churches in Metro Detroit and East Longmeadow, Massachusetts from 2006 to 2020. He received his BA from Wheaton College in Illinois, and this is Peter talking, where he learned he really isn't that sort of evangelical. When I found out it was Wheaton in Illinois, not Massachusetts, I said, but you're so normal. I'm just shocked. He then continued his education at Virginia Theological Seminary, where he received his Master of Divinity and vowed to move back here where winter exists. While in DC, he spent time working with the Salvadoran Church and experiencing the challenges created by governmental policies that create fear and pain in the lives of countless families. At Trinity, Peter has become engaged with numerous ministries in the city of Portland, advocating for and supporting asylum seekers and those experiencing homelessness. He's a co-founder of the new organization Neighbors Need Me, an interfaith coalition created to confront the housing crisis in Maine. And it was very active, as many of you know, I think in December and January when LD1, which became LD3, was under consideration. Even after last year's miserable showing, Peter writes, he is still a Red Sox fan. And I will add to that, even though he is a Red Sox fan, I am still his friend. Welcome, Peter. And I lived in New York City too long. Sorry, but no, not the Red Sox. Thank you for helping us take what we've learned just now from Terence and Devon, from Rick and from Lisa, and translate it into the language of faith-based advocacy.
Thank you, Jane. And, you know, I had to spend the last 11 years with a bishop who loved the Yankees, so we all have our cross to bear, right? Anyhow, one of the things that I just want to start with is a huge thank you to all of you from Preble Street. One of the first things I'm going to say is when we as people of faith engage, one of the really important things to realize is we're not experts. The experts are sitting right there in that little screen that says Preble Street. The experts are the people who live the realities that we've just heard. And one of the most important things that I know is that my job and our job is to listen and to learn and to be humble, and to pay attention to that real wisdom. And from that listening and that learning to then let that reality guide us. But also to recognize that from that wisdom and that knowledge, we then are able to know ourselves and our own stories. So here's a little bit of my own knowledge, my own life, and my own truth. I come from the Episcopal Christian background, and in that Episcopal Christian background, Hebrew scripture and Christian scripture are of importance, really pretty high importance. And similarly, an odd thing called the Book of Common Prayer is of high importance, and particularly something called the Baptismal Covenant. And those documents, those realities help kind of guide me as I interact with questions of public policy. They help guide me as I want to have conversations with friends, with family members, with parishioners. If we're just chatting over coffee, or if we're talking at church, or if there's going to be a sermon, because I can have my own personal opinions, but that's not necessarily my faith talking. And so what I find is that really, when there's this conversation about faith and policy, it's always this interplay, an interplay of the wisdom of those who know what they're talking about, which usually isn't me, an interplay of my own personal lived life experience, an interplay of my faith tradition and my passion, and then how God is doing something with the intermixing of all of that, and how God is activating something with that. I also find that there's two kind of realms that this plays out. And I'm just going to confess tonight that I'm going to spend a lot more time in one of those realms. But I want to raise them both up. One realm really is that like informal conversation that we have, say with friends, or even with parishioners over coffee. And that's the place where you get into a conversation, you're talking about, geez, I saw on the news the other night that ERA funding, the funding that had put up people in hotels during COVID, is ending, and we're looking at thousands of people facing mass eviction. This is terrible. And we start having a conversation. And so part of that is learning with the facts that we have, and then talking about, you know, how faith talks about, well, geez, I wouldn't do unto others what I wouldn't want done unto me. And there's that back and forth interplay that occurs, right? And I think that feels organic for us. I don't think that that usually makes us nervous and feel shaky, but I think it does start giving us some pointers towards what might happen in those places where it becomes higher stakes. Like, let's say there's 30 people at a gathering, and now we're talking about issues, you know, like LD3, and it's a question of politics, and it's a question of funding, and people are asking questions about how do we pay for this and what have you. And again, I just go back to the fact, I do not need to be the policy wonk. I don't need to be the expert who has all the answers. I can actually say, you know, I know a great person over at Preble Street who can answer all of those questions for you. Or I know some amazing people over at Maine Immigrant Rights Coalition, MERC, who could answer questions for you about issues when it comes to work permits and processes. But what I can tell you is that my tradition tells me right up front that I am called to welcome the stranger. I am called to do unto others as I would have them do unto me, you know, and I can speak that basic truth and kind of put that out there over and over again, because there's that interplay of the knowledge I have, the faith that I have, and put it forward. So here's an example of how this sort of played out for me. As Jane kindly mentioned, I am close to the Great Lost Bear. I'm also on Forest Ave, which is a pretty busy thoroughfare right here in Portland. It means that week in and week out, we have a flow of a lot of people coming here looking for help with housing. We also happen to have a deacon who works for the Maine Public Health Office. And as a result, he works with an awful lot of asylum seekers. And so during the months of October and moving towards November, he started bringing me pictures of eviction notices. Eviction notices coming from area hotels in South Portland, which were telling these folks that they were going to be losing their housing because federal funding was drying up. So we started just kind of checking in with area legislatures, asking what's the plan? What are we going to do? I mean, there are a lot of people in hotels. And we reached out to Merck, who told us, yep, we're looking at 1,000+ people being put out of hotels in December. And finding out from legislatures, there was no plan. And so what I know to do as a pastor is to reach out to people and to talk. I'm not an expert at much, but I am an expert at talking. I'll try not to do too much of it tonight. And so I talked to other pastors, and I talked to rabbis, and I talked to Buddhist leaders, and I talked to people who I could talk to. And I called the few folks I knew from Preble Street. And what I consistently found out is, my God, there's no bloody plan. And then we start learning it's not just Portland. It's like 25,000 across the state of Maine who have been supported by these federal funds that are disappearing, and there's no plan. And then, as is often the case, God pushed other people and coalitions start forming. And out of that lived experience, out of that sense that this is not the way of God, the other co-founder of Neighbors Need Me, Allison Smith, came to me, and we started pushing, not with details of policy, but simply by saying, this is not what people of goodwill and people of faith believe in. We do not believe that we forcibly push thousands of people out right at the beginning of winter. And, after a few policy meetings, we quickly were guided by Jane and others that what we don't do is policy. What we do is we pray. And so on the first day that the legislature convened, about 100 people of goodwill and people of faith of many different traditions, just like those gathered here tonight, headed up to the Hall of Flags in Augusta. And we didn't protest. We didn't have big signs that demanded anything. We stood there and we prayed, generally silently. And what happened is senators would walk over and ask, sometimes nicely and sometimes just like confusedly, what the heck are you doing? Because you'd have people like me wearing collars and people wearing stoles, and we'd have rabbis and all kinds of different people holding prayer beads and just praying. Because that is what we were, a people of faith, praying that justice might roll down like water and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream, and that we wouldn't be like the story that I was prepping children at my church to enact. Innkeepers who would say, sorry, there's no room. Get out of here. Like the story of Mary and Joseph, which we were literally about to reenact 20 days later at the Christmas pageant at Trinity Church. And as I'm sure my friends at Preble Street could tell you, nothing happened. Well, a lot happened, actually. I mean, it passed that day in the House of Representatives, but it didn't pass with the numbers it needed in the Senate. It failed with unanimous opposition by one of the parties. It didn't get 2/3 majority. And what that meant is that I got to go back to Augusta for a public hearing that lasted, Jane, how long did that public hearing last? That was long.
That lasted 5.5 hours, my friend.
Yeah, that was pretty fun.
5.5 hours.
I mean, that was good times. That was good times. And what I did in that piece of testimony, and this is where I think it feels even more awkward, is you really need to harness the truth that you know, the story, the faith story that you know, and real fact that you know. You can't make up fact. And I address them saying, this is who I am. I'm an Episcopal priest. Literally, I'm in the middle of writing my Christmas Eve sermon. Literally, I have children getting ready to tell the story of Mary and Joseph being turned away from an inn. And I want to tell you about people who are being turned away from hotel rooms right now and preparing to be kicked out in the cold. And right now you are about to debate whether or not to pass $21 million so that people either get kicked out or not. Guess what I think you should do? You know, and so it was an interplay of the truth I knew as a Christian and the truth of my life and the truth of actually knowing people in those hotels, people that I help wash clothing for and people who I give rides to, and telling, you know, real stories. And it was also making sure that we had other members of that coalition who did the same, so that multiple voices of faith showed up that day. And so that story was told over and over again. So my voice told it in one way, from one piece of what was important to me scripturally. And Jane told it in her way, and Allison told it in her way from her faith-based perspective. None of us came there giving policy rationale. We all came there telling the truth from our particular faith background of why the right thing was to give $21 million so that people didn't freeze to death in the middle of a Maine winter. Especially when we were talking about sending out, what, $650 checks for heating bills. So again, you know, I would just encourage you to understand, we don't need to be policy experts. What we do need to know is the truth of who we are, what we believe, and be able to identify parts of our faith story that speak to what is being discussed. We need to be able to show how faith connects with the legislative action that's being discussed. And so I want to actually use an example to do that. So earlier I guess yesterday, Devon sent me information about LR 1357, that act to decriminalize homelessness that we heard a little bit about, sponsored by Speaker Talbot Ross, which, you know, Preble Street's been helping to put together. I knew nothing about this bill per se until I read it yesterday and until we had our prep session a few days ago. And what I thought I could do is I could take the reality of who I am as an Episcopal priest, and also somebody who happens to know some folks here in Portland who sleep at Deering Oaks and right near some of the interstate exchanges here, and give you an example of what I might do if I went up to Augusta to testify. All right. I don't know what committee this would come before, so you're just going to hear a generic members of the committee introduction. But don't worry, Maine Council of Churches gives you a beautiful way of kind of like plugging in all the details. So here's how it goes. And I timed this. This is 3 minutes and 7 seconds, which technically is 7 seconds too long, which means they'd tell you to stop. So if you all were actually a state hearing committee, I would have cut out 7 seconds. I'll just tell you that right now. Members of the committee, my name is the Reverend Peter Swarr, and I'm pastor of Trinity Episcopal Church in Portland and co-founder of Neighbors Need Me, an interfaith group seeking to support people in the midst of the housing crisis, which is causing untold suffering in our state. I'm here to testify in support of LR 1357. I offer this testimony today because when I was 12 years old, I made a promise to God. I need to keep that promise today. You see, once a month, my church offers free washing and drying to anyone who needs it in Portland. Each month, lots and lots of households show up at Laundry Love. Last year, Trinity spent $16,000 on free laundry. And folks experiencing homelessness come to Laundry Love. And one of the people who comes is named Charlie. Charlie sleeps in a tent. Each month, Charlie washes his clothes, his sleeping bag, and his pillow. And he and I have gotten to know each other, and we talk. A few months back, city employees came into the park he's been sleeping in. They took his tent. They took his clothing, all of his items, because they had been told to clear the camp. I guess Charlie hadn't found the KOA in Portland that was offering free camping for the homeless. I'm here because I made a promise to God when I was baptized in a small church in Stroudwater neighborhood of Portland. And that night in the unheated water, as I had a truly spiritual experience, as I nearly froze to death, I said that I would promise to seek and serve Christ in all persons, loving my neighbor as myself, and I promised to strive for justice and peace among all people, respecting the dignity of every human being. Taking Charlie's things is not respecting his dignity. Stealing his very home is not his dignity. Criminalizing the place where he calls home is wrong. It's not loving him as myself. This is immoral. We can't and we shouldn't legislate Charlie out of existence. He is a beloved child of God in whom I see Jesus. Making him live in fear that all he has to survive might disappear at any moment stands in stark contrast to the teaching of the man I follow. So I stand here today asking you to support LR 1357. I ask you to pass this bill today. So that just gives you a sense. I mean, what you see is, I changed Charlie's name. That's not really his name, but it's a real story of a man that we wash clothing for and who told me this story. And we got him another tent and we got him more supplies from Maine Needs. I don't know if you all know Maine Needs. It's a phenomenal organization. And we actually managed to run over there because we do the laundry on Forest Ave right across from there. And one of their co-founders is part of our church. But so thank God for that, right? But it shouldn't take connections like that to get him his stuff back. So Preble Street guys, thank you for helping make that bill kind of start coming together, because I remember that day hearing that story and just, boiling over with anger and thinking like, what the heck do you do?
Yeah.
So Jane, you and I thought that maybe we would use that same bill, or I'm using the wrong words, but LR 1357, and invite folks who are on here right now to think, I intentionally used my baptismal covenant, which is a very Episcopal thing, to interact. But you know what? There are other things we could use. And we thought maybe those of you on this call, you would want to take a second right now and think, is there something from your faith tradition that you could imagine utilizing? A passage of scripture, a piece of poetry, something that would speak to this exact same issue of decriminalizing basically human existence when it comes to somebody who doesn't have the privilege of having a home right now.
Yeah, so folks, you can either use the reaction to raise your hand and we'll call on you, or you can populate the chat with phrases, with words, as you listen to Peter, and okay, like that was a Jaguar and most of us drive Ford Fiestas. So it doesn't need to be as beautiful as that was. He preaches for a living. So you all can do this. And what he did that you can do is speak from your heart. So if a legislator said to you the way they did to Shirley, why do you care so much about this? What would you say? what would you say? And they want to hear from you. That's the other thing you need to know. We're told over and over again from legislators that the progressive voice of faith needs to be heard in Augusta. So think about it for a minute. The chat is very quiet. Maybe you're just slow typers, but what sort of love your neighbor as yourself? I heard Peter use that one, which is in almost every world religion. There's some version of that, the golden rule. Baptismal covenant, respecting the dignity and sacredness of every human being. What comes to mind from your tradition? To whom much is given, much is expected. Good one, Christina.
That's great.
Yep. That, so to frame it in terms of privilege, because although I think this world would be a better place if there were people on the legislative committee who are experiencing homelessness, there aren't. So you can say from one person of privilege to another, my friends, let's talk about this. That dog would hunt, or that'd preach, as we say in my line of work. What else comes to mind for folks? Quakers often talk about seeing the light.
Tobin, that's beautiful. Act justly, love mercy.
Love mercy.
Yeah. Story of the Good Samaritan. Fabulous. Yeah.
That's great. Yep. Micah 6:8, you cannot go wrong with. That's right.
Never. How about the 8th commandment? Thou shalt not steal.
Mhm.
Don't be stealing their tent.
Yeah.
That's basic.
And it happens anytime someone has, almost anytime someone has a law enforcement encounter, certainly if they're arrested. There, but for the grace of God, there we might all be, yes, seeing ourselves, not an us and them, but an us and us,
Yeah.
caring for the least, the last, the lost. As a woman and a member of a family, homeless people can be members of any family, so see them as people just like you.
Yeah.
All of this could be used. It should be noted that a layperson is even more effective. That's right, because they know it's even scarier, right? Peter and I do public speaking for a living. Oh, I see a hand up. The Preble Street people are getting ready to preach.
Share.
So
Go
back
for
to
it, Rick.
Back to the 8th commandment. So getting back to that city policy thing, there's actually a policy in place where they're supposed to be bringing people's possessions to Amistad to store. And I was briefly working with Amistad as a peer support, and during the entire month of December, only one person's belongings had been brought to Amistad to be stored.
Yep.
You got to be kidding me.
And this was probably halfway through January that like the person didn't come in to claim it, so I was actually the person throwing it away. But like, or rather recycling, I did recycle the tent and sleeping bag to the donation room. But it was just amazing to me because I know for a fact that there's still people who are having their items seized and they're not following their own policy of storing it at Amistad.
That's right. And just think about when they cleared it just before Paul LePage had his big press conference. How many tents were cleared? Did they all go to Amistad?
So when the policy first went into effect, because when I was working there, I actually got to see the log that they were keeping. And when the policy first went into effect and like Giving Oaks got cleared, there was a bunch of things logged. And then it was like, all right, we had our press release moment. And then after that, it was specifically only park rangers who were doing it. So I know that I might have given them a little bit of hate in my thing there. Park rangers still did a lot better job than
They do.
PD.
They do.
So.
Yep. I will just tell you all, I thought of another one, which is not an initial thing that popped up, but Isaiah 65, 21 to 22 has this passage that talks about they will live in their own houses that they build. No one will take it away from them. This vision of, you have what you create and nobody takes it from you.
Yep. Zeb
Yeah,
Green
and
is
yes,
ready
Amos
to
is always tempting. Yes, it is.
open a can of whoop ass on them. Yes, sometimes that's called for. Vinegar, honey, who's going to win the flies, but sometimes you do get to that point. And are there any other We're going to move to a more general time of Q&A. But before we do, I want us to express our thanks to Peter for helping guide us and empower us, equip us, inspire us that we can do this work. We can. And Isaiah 58, oh, now I'll have to go look that up. Isaiah 58 verses 7 through 10. I bet, yep, Peter's got a Bible right there.
Because I was searching for verses earlier.
So as you talk, some people are hesitant to use this faith-based language because of separation of church and state. But you aren't asking them to put the Bible in our state constitution. You're telling them, I'm here in front of you because of what I believe and how important it is to me. So don't get dissuaded or, get off track by this. Oh, we shouldn't be talking about this. We don't want to make it a Christian nation. We don't want to make it a Christian state. We're here to talk about the moral imperative and some of where each of us finds the center for our moral imperative, our North Star, is our most deeply held beliefs. So Preble Street is back in the spotlight with you and me, Peter, and we're in our last few minutes going to just open it up to anyone in the audience that might have a question from Preble Street's presentation, from Homeless Voices for Justice, for Peter. You can either type it in the chat or you can use the raise hand function under reactions. If you see that little happy face with the plus sign at the bottom of your screen and click it, you'll see the raise hand function. And that way you'll move to the front of our screen and we'll know that you'd like to speak. So does anybody have a question for Terence, Devon, Rick, Lisa, or Peter? I'll keep an eye on the chat as well. Yes, Annalisa.
I heard that they were going to keep the hotels open till April. Is that true?
Yes.
Peter was there at the council meeting in South Portland in the early morning hours when the decision was made to keep them. It was after midnight, open until April 30th. So there is this short window of opportunity until April 30th where they will remain open. After that point in time, we don't know what's going to happen at that juncture. Peter, I don't know if you have more to add.
Well, and my understanding is that's also when the funding runs out as well.
Right.
Yeah, the 21 million from the LD3. And Tobin has dropped the link to the article about the hearing that Peter was at, that they're referring to. There were a couple of hotels that tiptoed right up to the edge of saying, we're closing, we're not going to do this anymore. But it does look like people will have a warm place with a roof over their head through April.
But I will just add this caveat. One of the tricky pieces is newly arrived folks who weren't already pre-existing. It's tricky. Like newly arrived, that 21 million from LD3 doesn't seem to apply to them. At least that's my understanding. Am I getting that right, experts?
Is it murky?
Yeah.
Peter, that's my understanding as well. You had to be here by a certain date, by a cutoff point. So.
Right, because I mean, my experience is I keep getting asylum seekers right now, and we cannot get them in hotels.
Right.
We did hear from Greg Payne yesterday, and Terence and Devon, you can help me get my facts straight, that, and it's a drop in the bucket, that 52 units for 52 families of asylum seekers are going to come online in the next week.
The Avesta, yeah, the Avesta.
Yeah, Avesta, not hotel rooms, but housing.
Right. In South Portland, yeah.
But, and that sounds great. And your heart sort of lifts, like 52 families. And then you are like 300 families are still looking for somewhere to call home. So it's something, but it's.
And 2 to 3 families arrive a week.
Yeah. Is the goal to house everyone, or to accept that some people may want to live in tents and to leave them alone Or is this a false binary? That's a question for our Preble Street friends.
Go ahead.
Oh, no, I mean, I feel like public property is public property. Like, I mean, obviously you can't be obstructing sidewalks, and I have run into some people who do choose to be homeless. But, yeah, I don't think that it should be a criminal act to decide that you want to live outside. Especially, I don't know if this is murky water now, but when you compare it to like the way that, you know, the Abenaki were living before we settled here and kind of kicked them out of their home. You know, if people want to live that way still, I don't think society has a right to say you can't do that on this legal basis.
I mean, to speak to her particular question, I don't mean this in any like rude way, but I don't think most people in general like are choosing like when they want to live in tents and leave them alone. I think that would probably be a very slim minority, in my opinion.
That's been my experience, although that was more in Washington, D.C. than it is here in Maine, but that given a choice, most people would prefer to be housed.
Great, and I'm included in that. I would prefer to be housed.
You would, okay. So there was a question from Sarah about the 5.5-hour public hearing on LD3. Yeah, the testimony was all like, you guys need to support this. The comments coming from some of the senators, and I guess one representative, because it was a joint committee, was negative. You know, the GOP was still positioning themselves to possibly oppose it and kill it. In the end, they didn't. And
I was talking
Portland.
about South Portland. It was unanimously supportive in South Portland.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, I wasn't there. I'm glad you were. They
And-
were
and-
looking. Yep.
And Peter, just to include some of that high school testimony in particular of peers of high school students from South Portland High School testifying that on their teams in their classrooms that people with different languages and cultures add to the diversity of that learning environment. And when you see that in the next generation, when you look for opposition in these things, it's really affirmative to see that testimony delivered.
Yeah. And I would add that I'd like to give a charge to people who are part of communities of spiritual practice that are congregations. Go back and talk to the high school students in your congregations and help them learn what you learned here tonight and encourage them to submit testimony or to do a one-on-one meeting with your legislator in district. For those of you who've not been to the State House, our legislators do not have offices unless they're in leadership. So it's best to set up a meeting back in district if you're going to do one-on-one, and to have a teenager there equipped and ready to offer a statement about why they care so much is powerful, very powerful. So if you all think about ways to do that. The other way you can carry this message back to your home congregations is through the recording of this event, as well as the other 2 legislative workshops. They will come online probably sometime next week or the week after that, and they will be edited in a way that you can use them like in an adult ed class or a youth group setting. Watch it, talk about it, you know, go on the websites of Preble Street or Maine Prisoner Advocacy or Wabanaki Alliance, whatever group, and learn, and then track the bills and be ready to speak. Another way you can have a voice is letters to the editor, and to speak boldly with a voice of faith for justice through a letter to the editor can be very impactful. We are up to our last minute, and I want to thank our speakers one more time before I let everybody know that we do have one last sort of bonus session of this series, and there'll be a slide to tell you more about that. But first, thank you, Peter, Terence, Lisa, Devon, Rick, You are amazing, and we are grateful for the work you do each and every day and for the gifts you've given us here tonight. We are truly grateful. So with that, we have concluded the online portion of this faith-based advocacy series for 2023, except for the in-person option you have to join us for a tour of the State House in Augusta on Tuesday, February 28th from 10 a.m. to noon. We'll meet in the Welcome Center, and that is after you come up the stairs and go through what looks like airport security, the little scanner and the little not treadmill, but belt, that takes your stuff through. On your right, you'll see the Welcome Center. We'll gather there, and then we'll have an opportunity to see the State House. And dropped into the chat right now is a link to the registration. That doesn't cost you anything. We just need you to sign up because we have to be able to know the number that will be in our group. So you're invited to do that. We hope that some folks can join us. I know if you've been to the State House 1,000 times, you probably don't need to do this, but if you've never been, or you've only been once or twice, or want to learn more, we hope that you'll join us on Tuesday, February 28th. But until then, I just want to give you a word to carry out into the night. It's a word that the pastor who raised me in the same town where Peter Swarr had his first call as a priest, we learned the other day. And it's this: go now into the world in peace, my friends, and strive to learn the language of the heart. And may the love of God go with you this night and every day to come. Thank you all for being here tonight. Go in peace. Be well. Amen.